Hello and welcome to Wild Sound Civilized, your bi-monthly podcast about music, literature, and everything betwixt. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about the Game of Thrones soundtrack.
So super important to note, we are not talking about Game of Thrones. We are talking about the Game of Thrones soundtrack.
So no spoilers for the show.
No. Okay, if there are spoilers, we will announce them.
I can't see us spoiling the show. Like I don't know how we care about characters, really.
Yeah, I can see it happening.
Okay.
I feel like there's a lot of things that happen, right? It takes 7 seasons for it to actually develop.
Okay.
There's time involved.
Okay.
So in our prelude segment, we're going to talk a little bit about why we picked this soundtrack.
So this was your suggestion, Bailey.
This is my suggestion.
Why did you want to talk about this?
I really want to talk about fantasy and the sounds that we associate with fantasy and why we associate them with fantasy. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is just like the monolithic, perfect fantasy soundtrack right now. If this was like 10, 15 years ago, we'd be talking about Lord of the Rings. I really just want to sort of tease out the ideas of why.
Okay.
You know, some of the choices. I read the books. I have seen the entirety of the show. You have read the books.
I've read the books and I have watched the television show up to where the books end. And then I have just sort of followed along with the internet, accepting spoilers as they came, because I have too many other things to do with my life than watch a show that seemed to go downhill fast after the books ended.
You definitely made the right call.
Yeah.
I wish that I had also done that. Because I can honestly say the last couple of seasons were some of the most disappointing television I have ever seen. But not the soundtrack.
Okay.
Soundtrack was still pretty good. It was on an even keel all the way through, which is why we're talking about the soundtrack.
Okay, quick question, because I did not look this up. Was there a soundtrack for each season, or did...
I'm not sure. There was, differences in music for each season, but a lot of what this soundtrack does is it takes certain themes that are associated with certain ideas or characters or places, and it sort of weaves them into what sort of ambient sounds are created for a scene. So even though there are differences, say, in the way season 1 and season 7 are sort of orchestrated by the composer, they're the same musical themes, they're the same ideas, and I would say there's not a huge difference from one to the other in how it's actually done. I would say it's pretty standard in terms of what people do these days for a soundtrack. There's nothing radically different about this one. We really just want to talk about this idea in general.
Alright, so let's hop into the context section, where we give you a little bit of background on the piece, the composer, anything we need to know about this, Bailey?
Well, it's composed by, and I'm really going to try for this pronunciation, Ramin Djawadi? Not sure about that W, but he's done a bunch of soundtracks lately, and a lot of what he's doing I'm enjoying. He did the Westworld soundtrack, which I'm going to go out on a couple of limbs and say has been like my favorite TV soundtrack of the past 5 years or so.
All right.
Even though I haven't watched the show. It's really good because he does this thing where he tends to play around with diegetic music. What I like in Westworld is obviously the conceit of Westworld is that you're in like this future world where it's an amusement park and everybody's a robot, but it's the Old West. There's this old player piano in a bunch of the episodes that will play like Radiohead tunes, but like honky tonk and Old Westy, or like Rolling Stones tunes, and they're amazing. One of my favorite pastimes is playing Radiohead on a honky tonk piano. I legitimately spend at least an hour every week doing that. So in Game of Thrones, he does that too. He's got diegetic music with sort of the tunes that are outlined in the books, and then they're woven into the soundtrack itself. So he's very aware of the music that the characters are creating and the music that he's creating to heighten situations that is not actually a part of the reality for the characters.
Right. So just to be clear, diegetic music is music that you hear in the story. So if in a contemporary piece a character puts on a CD in a scene, the song coming out of their player is diegetic music.
Yeah, so they're experiencing it.
Right. So the music that they can't hear, that the composer sort of overlays over top, is incidental music, right?
Incidental, yes.
Yeah.
That's the word I was missing. Yeah, so he tends to do a lot of that. He has also worked with a couple of other composers. Klaus Badelt, who did the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack. He worked sort of as an assistant, I believe, on that one. And you were saying to me that you heard similarities.
Yes.
Between the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack and this one.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. I love the Pirates of the Caribbean.
It's so
good. And he's also worked with Hans Zimmer, who of course has done everything. If it's a soundtrack that you have paid attention to in the past 10 years while watching a movie, it was probably Hans Zimmer, for better or worse.
Some examples, maybe?
Inception. The dun, 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 dun.
Okay.
That one. You remember the Sherlock Holmes soundtrack? It was really good.
Like the new ones
Yeah.
with Robert Downey
Yeah.
Jr.? Yeah.
Like dun 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 dun. It was all
Okay.
weird and quirky and fun.
Okay.
That one. What else did Hans Zimmer do? He's done a whole bunch of things, and usually his soundtracks sort of stick out. They have something unique to them. I don't think that this one necessarily has that, but highly recommend, if you're looking for a Hans Zimmer soundtrack to listen to, the Sherlock Holmes one is the first one. Is really, really good. And the other context here, of course, is that this is not music that's composed to listen to alone. This is definitely commercial music where somebody is paid to write something to go with a film. This isn't somebody giving artistic freedom to a composer to just make up what you feel. It's I need you to get this across in this scene, which maybe changes how you listen to it. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But I would like to talk a little bit about that in Program Notes, our segment where we talk about kind of the related ideas.
So one of the things that I think we need to talk about with this is adaptation theory. Obviously Game of Thrones is, like the television show Game of Thrones is adapted from A Song of Ice and Fire
A Song of
series
Ice and Fire, yep.
by George R.R. Martin. So we're taking something that is written that has no sounds and we're making it visual and we're giving it sounds with the music. What exactly is adaptation? Robert Stam, who is a professor at New York University, thinks of filmic adaptation as a dialogic process. So dialogic is basically the idea that people are talking to each other or texts are talking to each other. It's a continual dialogue between that work of literature and whatever it's being turned into, whether that's a film or a television series. It's dialogic in that it goes both ways. The experience of the reader is sort of in dialogue with both.
So then a question I have for you, knowing that you have a much stronger understanding of adaptation theory than I do, is would you consider the soundtrack to a work to be an adaptation of the visual work if you're listening to it on its own? Does that mean that the book is its own thing, the show is its own thing, but the soundtrack that's composed to go with the show being listened to on its own, does it communicate those story beats? Does it feel like an adaptation, or is it a part of a larger artwork that we're consuming in pieces?
That is a good question. I like that question. So I would say that maybe in some cases, the soundtrack might be able to tell the story. I would say definitely not in this case.
No.
An adaptation has to stand alone. That's one of the key things.
Okay.
Is that it has to be able to communicate that story to the consumer, I guess, is the most generic term for reader, watcher, listener.
Yeah, an uncomfortable term, but
Yeah.
a correct one.
And I don't think that this soundtrack in any way, shape, or form communicates the political complexities, the character complexities that the show does.
Yeah, we're definitely agreed on that front. And I think a lot of that is limitations of the medium. But on the other hand, a lot of that is the latter seasons and not having a book, right? Like at some point this goes from an adaptation to a creation.
Yeah.
And there's a very clear drop in quality. Does it mean the overall piece now is still an adaptation, given that it's working from the same source material? Like, would fan fiction be an adaptation?
I would say no.
So what is Game of Thrones then as a series as a whole?
A mess. It's a mess.
It's a mess.
Sorry. As a serious answer, I
Yep.
honestly don't know.
Okay.
Because I feel like we haven't really seen the same sort of scaled project. Like, I can't think of another project that was adapted without the source material. Like, I think the next biggest thing in the past that we can look at is Harry Potter. And the earlier books were being adapted without the later books, so they had to do some, like, backpedaling. Like, with the Harry-Ginny relationship and romance.
Right, yeah.
Ginny wasn't an important character until, like, the 5th book came out, and they were like, oh, crap, right?
Yeah.
Now we have to make her interesting. Like, they still had that ability to backpedal.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Game of Thrones is maybe there are other examples, but it's probably the biggest example that I can think of that surpassed its source material.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way to fix it.
Yeah, so you're mentioning Harry Potter. Does this sort of adaptation, these sort of adaptational problems, do you see them more often in fantasy?
I feel like fantasy doesn't get adapted very often.
Really? I feel like I only ever hear fantasy adaptations. But
I think contemporaries get adapted a lot more. I don't know if maybe there's more enthusiastic fan response behind fantasy adaptation.
yeah, that's fair. Because, yeah, fan results were fairly enthusiastically angry, I would say, for the past couple of months. Which I feel like we're just harping on how bad the latter seasons were, but you haven't even seen them. I had to watch them.
Yeah. I also feel like fantasy is unique in that they're trying to pull out long projects.
That's fair.
Whereas the contemporaries that get adapted are not, like, what contemporary book series? I guess Outlander would be the next closest thing of, like, it's not contemporary, though. It's a genre soup that gets marketed as general fiction.
I mean, Outlander is my trash.
Right.
So I'm happy to talk about Outlander for hours. But I think the difference between something like Outlander and something like Game of Thrones is that, and maybe this is just me, I'm not reading/watching Outlander because I care greatly about the political machinery or the outcome of different things, or for shock. I am reading and or watching Outlander for a specific set of different reasons. And I think most people know that when they're watching something like that. It is guilty pleasure. It's wine mom gold. And as a future wine mom, I can't help but approve. The difference with Game of Thrones is I think everybody wanted to know what happened next. There was a lot invested on figuring things out and having theories and just caring what happened. And I wonder how much of that caring and feeling emotional about things and having just these really huge epic moments comes down to being the soundtrack. Maybe some of the problems in the later seasons would have been more obvious if you kind of take that soundtrack away. Like, I'm thinking of specific scenes where, spoiler alert, someone is beheaded in the first season. Part of the shock of that, I think, is the sounds in it. Part of the shock of that whole episode is the fact that you get this very, like, typical hero music and everything swells and you're like, oh, it's gonna be okay, and then it isn't.
Right.
And the music always plays into our emotions.
Right.
Like, music is an auditory drug in a lot of ways, in that I can play a sad song and make you sad. And maybe that camouflages different types of filmmaking that are less emotionally effective.
I think that's fair.
It's a pretty effective soundtrack. That's what I would say. I wouldn't say it's like a stellar soundtrack. I wouldn't say that it's a unique soundtrack. I would say that it's an effective soundtrack.
Do we want to talk a little bit about what fantasy is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is fantasy,
Okay.
Emily?
The earliest forms of written fiction from the ancient world could be understood as fantasy, and they definitely influenced modern writers. If you think about stories of gods and heroes, Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid?
Aeneid?
Beowulf.
Beowulf.
Right?
Can we do an episode on Beowulf?
We
Just
should.
side note, I love Beowulf.
Yeah, we should.
So good.
Greek and Roman stories remained known to Western storytellers throughout the Middle Ages, and we see that influencing folk and fairy stories. Folk and fairy stories are sort of, if you think about literature as like a braid, fairy tales sort of get woven in. Same with these god stories, hero stories, big epics, that kind of stuff. The Icelandic sagas, huge. Tolkien fucking loved the Icelandic sagas. So much borrowing has happened from like previous literature, and a lot of that is the early literature that we probably wouldn't actually shelve in genre fantasy.
Right. I was going to say, I kind of, like, I'm hearing what you're saying, but to me, the Odyssey and the Aeneid would be myth, right? Mythological, or they would be epic poems in that they're a different sort of format. And folk tales would be a different format on its own. And I think the timeline between the creation of a tale and the consumer of a tale comes into play here. Because when I think of fantasy as like a genre, like on the shelves at Indigo, I'm thinking of written within the past 20 years and the weirdest hodgepodge of different historical periods. No accuracy to any history, but the feeling of being historical, but also being entirely a modern invention.
It depends on how you want to define it.
Okay.
Loosely, and the way that a lot of scholars go, is to define fantasy as the presence of the impossible and the unexplainable, which is sort of what makes a clear break between fantasy and science fiction, because science fiction might be impossible right now, but it is plausible scientifically.
Explained in some way, yeah.
So fantasy is anything that sort of falls into that fantastic, like non-real. It's a response to the realism movement, actually.
Cool.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
The realism movement.
Yeah.
Not my jam. I find that interesting because that definition is so incredibly broad. Like, I could put anything in there, really, if I argued for it. And yet, when I say fantasy, you say fantasy, I think, apart from that denotation, there's very clear connotations to it. Like, I'm thinking dragons. I'm thinking castles. I'm thinking swords. I'm thinking sorcery. I'm thinking heroes with beards.
So you're thinking of the Tolkien-esque fantasy that sort of derives from the Arthurian myth and legend.
I think it's impossible to talk about what fantasy is without talking about Tolkien. Like, he really just set the... What is it? Well, it's Tolkien. It just is. Tolkien derivatives, in my mind at the very least. And when I think of fantasy that sort of bends that or moves around, it's often fantasy that I wouldn't classify as entirely fantasy. My first brush with science fiction fantasy was Artemis Fowl when I was like 10, 12, where there's elves and fairies and all of that, and yet there's also a lot of science fiction, and it kind of all interrelates in a way. And that's the sort of thing where I don't know if I'd call that just fantasy. Like, do you have a broader definition in your mind of what fantasy would be?
For me, it largely involves the impossible, the inclusion of the impossible. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it defines its world rules and it sticks within them, so it doesn't break that secondary world that it makes.
So you're saying fantasy is kind of a diorama in the author's mind with a time that they create?
Yes. It can be anything that you want, which is the beautiful part and the frustrating part, because you'll see scholars talk about it, like Rosemary Jackson argues that fantasy is the literature of subversion. It has all this potential because it doesn't have to be real. It doesn't have to work mathematically. Right. It just has to function in its own space, and so you can do whatever you want with that. And so that leaves it very open, very broad. That's maybe not how your average reader who walks into a store thinks of fantasy, but I think the space is open for that.
I mean, what's the furthest thing you would feel comfortable defining as fantasy, but still sort of on the fringes of not being fantasy? Like, are there things that you can define as fantasy that don't follow those things that I was talking about, like the sword and sorcery, helmets and dragons?
We could go the problematic route.
Okay.
Which some people do when they talk about indigenous literature and the quote-unquote magic in them. Right. Which, from an indigenous perspective, probably should be read as real and spiritual, opposed to fantastic and magical. Yeah. I think the closest that we could maybe get to something like that is Eden Robinson's Trickster trilogy. She's an indigenous author. It's about indigenous characters meeting indigenous gods and beings. At the same time, it is trying to be fantasy literature. Like, it is trying to play with those genre tropes more than it is trying to explore indigenous culture from a spiritual perspective. Okay. In the way that something like Richard Wagamese or Richard Van Camp, or are they both Richards? Or is it not Richard Wagamese?
I don't read.
Okay. There could be two Richards. I know it's definitely Richard Van Camp, who does Godless but Loyal to Heaven, which are sort of wacky and spiritual at the same time that they're magical and playing with white, Western, heavy quotes around those genres.
Yeah. I can't help but think about, like, I read a lot of weird fiction, and a lot of it is just called weird fiction because you don't know where to place it. But it definitely falls under that fantasy label, and yet it could not be further from a lot of things. Like Harry Potter. Lovecraft and Harry Potter, I do not see the similarity, and yet they would both fall under that definition. Like, do you think there's a value in having these subgenres and these sort of more niche sort of labels for things within fantasy? Like, is fantasy a large enough thing, umbrella term, that it covers more than I think it does?
Yes, exactly. Fantasy is the umbrella term, and I feel like folk and fairy stories, myth, horror, the fantasy genre we see, breaks down into contemporary fantasy, portal fantasy, right?
Right. So you're seeing this, yeah, I guess I'm seeing it more as like a straight and narrow genre according to how it's marketed to me, I think. And I think those subgenres, some of them I wouldn't necessarily even think of under that umbrella. But that's useful. I think that's useful in how we consume our media and how we sort of determine what we like and what we don't like. I mean, I am not a fan of a lot of fantasy. I do like a lot of fantasy as well, but like I'm very picky with my fantasy, and I think there's value in those subgenres. I think that there's a problem sometimes with fantasy being sort of discounted as, I mean, nerdery, for lack of a better term. And I wonder if having those further subgenres is just another way to sort of dismiss them. Like in a literary genre, you could have The Handmaid's Tale, but that could also kind of be like dystopian future. That could also be a little bit even science fiction. But in a literary genre, you're not defining it. You're not putting it into that tiny box, or at least I'm not aware of that happening.
The difference is how it's been marketed to you. So it all comes back to how well can we sell this object? Because The Handmaid's Tale is science fiction.
Yeah.
And it gets included in science fiction courses as like feminist science fiction.
Okay.
But publishers know that if you throw Margaret Atwood into the genre shelves, it's not going to sell as well, right?
Okay.
So you throw it on the literary fiction shelf, suddenly it's high and mighty, and if you read it, you're a smart person. You're not some, like, basement-dwelling... Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
yep, I totally hear that.
Like, there's that distinction between readers of genre. I'm saying this as a reader of genre, as somebody who struggled to find a supervisor in my master's, couldn't do a PhD because I couldn't find a supervisor who was willing to supervise my niche interest in the lowly genre fiction of fantasy and children's literature. Two niches that they don't like.
That's so strange to me. Like, I don't understand this hierarchy of genres in the first place.
It's there, though. And it's interesting when you think about it intersecting with race, because Marlon James, who wrote the 7 Killings of something or other that won super prizes a couple of years ago. Oh, God.
It'll be in the program notes.
I'm a horrible person. Yes, we will put them in the notes. Obviously, I didn't read it, but Marlon James wrote this book that is a prize-winning thing. You are considered a literary smart person if you've read it, you know. His fantasy novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, was put in genre fiction, which is a weird choice because he's been established as a literary author. That fantasy book is so heavy. Like, your genre reader will not have fun with Black Leopard, Red Wolf. But he's black, and he wrote this fantasy, and they threw it in genre fiction, whereas Margaret Atwood is white, and she wrote a genre fiction, and they threw it in literary fiction. Like, I think there's a lot going on with how objects can be sold.
Yeah.
Yay, capitalism.
Yay. Womp womp.
I know. So how much of the genre itself is its marketability versus, like, the actual content?
I guess my question would be, do you see any sense in there being genres at all? Purely from a consumer standpoint. Like, not from buying, not from sort of breaking them down academically, but I enjoy this book, and do I need to know the genre? Does the genre matter to me?
You don't necessarily need to know the genre, and I think you'll see that with bookstores where they'll throw like a new and hot wall. I work at Indigo, Canadian retailer, and we'll throw together like a new and hot wall, and it's a whole mishmash of genres. And so you might not know that you're picking up a genre fiction.
Right.
So you might pick up something that you never would have tried if it was buried in the stacks. So I do see some value to not pigeonholing.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, that genre reader who goes to the stacks might accidentally pick up Marlon James and end up with something like really heavy and literary and challenging themselves.
So as you say, buried in the stacks, I wonder how much of this typifying and codifying genre has to do with oversaturation in terms of the amount of books there are in the world and how many people read those books. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yep. Okay. All right. Light bulb moment.
Yep.
Do we want to move into counterpoints?
Yeah.
So counterpoints is our segment where we want to kind of argue with the work. I'm wondering, does this soundtrack sound historical to you?
Not at all.
Nope. I mean, was that even a question? This sounds like most other soundtracks coming out now. I think that you could take a modern scene in a... What's a modern thing? What do people watch now?
Cop shows?
Cop show. Take a cop show. Put the Game of Thrones soundtrack over top. I'm not talking about like the recognizable parts, but take some of that incidental music that's from like a battle scene where it's just generic percussion and chin, 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 chin. And you've got exactly what you would have had otherwise. Not to say there aren't recognizable parts. There are definitely recognizable parts. There's like the songs that are diegetic to this one. There's the Rains of Castamere and there's Jenny of Oldstones. And there's the main theme, which they tie through things, which is really iconic. But a lot of the music that's threaded throughout is really just that background. And that background itself, you could put anywhere. You could put it on cat videos on the internet.
You could.
I mean, you could do that ironically, but you could put it on like a dramatic cat video on the internet and have it be like pulling at your heartstrings.
Have you seen the video of the guy with 2 kittens?
No.
Where he like smashes them together and like he's edited over like it's like slow-mo, like he's edited card noises and then he smashes the kittens together. Yeah, you could put the Game of Thrones over that. If I can find that video, I will link it because
okay, yeah.
I cry
haven't
laughing
seen
every
this.
time.
I'm mildly concerned for the kittens though.
He's very gentle. It's a slow-mo car crash.
Okay, alright. Okay. I think part of the difficulty in making this sound historical, if you wanted to go that route, which I'm into, would love it, somebody go this route please, is that there isn't a historical time to do. If you had to, what would you classify the time period they're mainly drawing on here?
I would say based on the buildings, the clothes, and the technology, we're looking at like the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think medieval feudalism is kind of what they're trying to go for, or I think what George R.R. Martin was trying to go for. It's difficult because we're judging the soundtrack off of the show, off of the book. And I do think the book may have leaned a little bit older than the show in terms of costuming choices.
I can't think of any clothing being mentioned in the books. It's been a long time
Yeah,
since
well,
I've read the
exactly.
books.
You just hear like doublet or like gauntlet or things that don't end in let. But yeah, the clothing that's mentioned are things that could have existed throughout like a 500-year span. And so I feel like the books lean slightly older. I'm gonna throw out a number, and I'm gonna say the books are leaning towards like 1100, and I'm gonna say that the shows are leaning kind of 1400. Do you hear what I mean?
Yeah.
I am splitting hairs at this point. We're talking about medieval feudalism, and a lot of them come from different cultures as well. Like a lot of the inspiration for the King's Landing clothing to me seems almost like it's pulled from like East Asian sort of traditions, in terms of like the fabrics, the cuts, the choices that they're making with embroidery. And so if you look at the soundtrack, it does the same thing in terms of pulling in different cultural sort of ideas, but it's all within the context of a modern ear. And I do think that if you had a rock band play it, it would be virtually indistinguishable from a lot of what's on the market right now in rock. Like, it's very percussive. It's very minor for the most part. Lots of strings. It's pretty standard and it's pretty modern. And I've been trying to figure out why so many soundtracks skew this way. And I actually had another light bulb moment when I was watching a YouTube video about the makeup on the movie Titanic. Bear with me.
Okay.
I love Kate Winslet, but anytime you watch Titanic now, the first thing you see are that her eyebrows are like penciled on. and that her lipstick is brown. Legitimate, like, even if it's red, it's, like, kind of brown.
Like 90s brown.
90s brown, exactly. And, like, she looks overly powdered, and her blush is in, like, tiny circles on her cheeks. It's a mess. Like, you're imagining it in your head. Mm-hmm. Highly recommend go back and watch Titanic because it's a mess. But I was watching a makeup artist talk about it and basically said that even when you're doing a period piece, you have to do makeup of the era you're in because the audience will not be able to connect with the face of someone that looks like they don't know. I don't know if I worded that correctly. They have an easier time connecting with someone if their face looks modern. And I wonder if that's the same thing with the music, right? Because it's entirely working on your emotions throughout the piece. If we put historical music into Game of Thrones, is it as emotionally effective?
Okay, so I'm of two minds here with the music.
Okay. Let me hear both.
So, on the one hand, this is a genre piece. Game of Thrones is often talked about as fantasy for people who don't like fantasy. So having a generic soundtrack to sell fantasy to a wider audience seems like a smart move. Having it not be something that really sticks out and just sort of complements whatever is happening seems like a smart move in terms of marketing.
Yeah.
At the same time, because it is fantasy, and fantasy is the literature of subversion, it's the story of subversion, based on the rules that you can do whatever you want, provided it's internally consistent in your world, they could have gone really, like, wonderful, weird, wacky.
Yep.
Played with instruments from different cultures and created a very unique sound for the show that would have fit within the context of fantasy because it doesn't have to be historical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, the history is a veneer. Like, let's be real here. You could set Game of Thrones in space, and I would really enjoy that. If somebody set Game of Thrones in space. But I think that just sort of this, and I don't want to say boilerplate, but like the way that the soundtrack is typical of soundtracks today, I get it, and yet I want it to go so far and so weird and so wonderful. Like, even if it doesn't go historical, and I do want it to go historical, just full disclosure, very biased. Like you're saying, it could involve very different sounds. It's a different world. It's an impossible world. What can happen? But do you feel like that would take a listener out yet again?
For sure.
So at what point, I guess, does this composition have to be commercial versus artistic? It is fully commercial in my mind.
Yes.
I guess in our Coda, I'm going to suggest some things that are not fully commercial, but that do play with those ideas. I guess fantasy music is a genre I have not explored, and I don't mean fantasy soundtracks, but music that is fantastical, although we did do Symphony Fantastique.
It's true.
But I wouldn't call that fantasy.
No.
Call that psychedelia.
Was it fantasy as in genre fantasy, or fantasy as, like, wish fulfillment?
I don't know.
Like the more whimsical, romantic, desirous fantasy?
Yeah. I don't know. But a lot of it had, like, a storyline, right? Like, the last couple of movements had, like, a arc.
Yep.
And it wasn't necessarily wish fulfillment. It got weird and bad.
True.
And deathy.
Yep.
I don't know. But music telling a story that is a fantasy, that's something I find really interesting. I will point out that the thing that greatly annoyed me while listening to the soundtrack on its own in preparation for this episode was that the diegetic music, the Rains of Castamere and Jenny of Old Stones, their official recorded versions are so auto-tuned that it sounds like T-Pain. And this may be just the specific ones that I listen to. In the show, I don't think it's as bad, but it's there. And this is specifically in the sort of last season. I think Jenny of Old Stones didn't pop out until like season 6. And I don't think either are on the Game of Thrones soundtrack collector's edition vinyl.
So I don't think they're on the edition that I listened to either.
I think I sought them out on purpose, but both versions that I heard were just, you know, the auto-tune sound, right?
Yes.
The slippy, slidey, made of plastic, terrible, terrible sound.
Yep.
And why would you do that? Why would you put that in to a fantasy show?
Was it auto-tuned in the show?
I think it was less auto-tuned in the show because I know Ed Sheeran sang one of the songs and I think Florence and the Machine sang another one of them, but then there's another version of some of them.
Things got weird when I stopped watching.
Yeah, oh yes, they did. And one day I strongly encourage a good old hate watch.
Okay. Okay.
I think you would enjoy it. Just get some wine, or you could just watch Outlander. It's another thing you could do.
So to quickly deviate, because that is a text we've both consumed.
Yep.
How does the soundtrack fare? Because Outlander is a book that is marketed as general fiction, that has elements of history, fantasy, science fiction with the time travel. Like, it's a real genre fiction mash.
So the soundtrack for Outlander does something similar to the Game of Thrones soundtrack in that it's a lot of incidental music that doesn't stand out. Its job is not to stand out. Its job is just to play on your emotions. And then a few songs that just catch you in your heart forever and always. Like that opening title,
Yes.
Digression. But 2 days ago, I was at like a recorder rehearsal with a group of people that I had never played with before. And I had that moment of like, I don't know these people. What are we going to play? What's going on? And I heard somebody warming up with the tune of that song. And I was like, I'm good. I'm with my people. We're good. And it's so like, again, iconic. And it communicates what the piece is about, like the whole work. And I think more and more I hear soundtracks going that direction, where they go for a really big theme song that you can memorize and know and understand and hear anywhere you happen to be. And then the music itself within the work is always just kind of background. You see that especially on TV, because of course you want to have that big theme song. But I think the big theme song is more of a past 5 years thing than anything else. I mean, the only theme song that I can remember from more than 10 years ago is the Friends theme song, and that's because I hate it. Do you feel like TV themes have always been as big of a thing as they are now?
I feel like a lot of TV themes used to be just a popular song, and now it's things written specifically for the show. Friends theme song,
I see what you mean. Yep.
is like a larger pop song that they cut down. The opening to One Tree Hill is a larger song.
Are we dating ourselves right now,
yes.
Emily?
Yes, we are.
I think of really good theme songs. I think of the 90s cartoons that I watched growing up.
Which are more like jingles.
Jingles, exactly. It's like an ad hook. And nowadays it seems like they're going for like a song, and it's got to be the big thing that you hear. Like even Breaking Bad. What was the theme song on Breaking Bad?
I think it was just like plinky noises, wasn't it?
It sounded like a podcast opening.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, like when things are coming out, I think there's pressure to have like the sound, like Westworld, very Westworldy. I know I'm watching Westworld. I think part of the problem is that movie composers have a deadline, and very rarely, unless you're at the very top of your game and people just trust you to do amazing things, are you given the leeway to just make stuff up.
Right.
But if everybody could just make stuff up, that sounds good to me. Welcome to the Coda, where we're going to talk about our individual takeaways and a little bit about the next episode and the homework we will assign you.
So what did you take away from this?
I really enjoyed listening to a soundtrack separately than the work. It illuminated things for me, because you can't, I think, view them differently. They're the same thing. They have to be done together. And listening to it separately, I think, makes it clearer to me what works and what doesn't work in the show. Yeah, it made it also clear to me how different modern soundtracks are to what we think of as classical music. I don't want to say proper, but like classical music. In some ways they're the same, in some ways they're different, but it's basically just modern instrumental music.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, what did you think of this one?
Having listened to a couple of different types of instrumental music now, and like listening with intention.
Yeah, that's half of it. Yep.
I didn't before. It's not really a thing that I do. I think it's interesting to have listened to something like Peter and the Wolf or Symphonie Fantastique and seeing clear storytelling happening in music.
Yeah.
And then listen to the Game of Thrones soundtrack and hearing like marketability in the soundtrack without storytelling.
Yeah, the soundtrack is along for the ride. It's not pushing things along.
Yeah.
Which is a big difference. And I'm really happy that you're, like, noticing that, because it means it's not all in my head.
The other thing, like, I don't know how to... Have you seen the South Park episode for Game of Thrones?
No.
So, the, like, running joke in the South Park is that George R.R. Martin is obsessed with wieners. And so they sing the word wiener. There's a chorus of men who sing wiener to the Game of Thrones theme song.
That's... Wow.
Nice and soft, non-erect wieners. And I've had that stuck in my head since we, like a week ago, decided to do Game of Thrones, and I started listening to the soundtrack every time.
Can't unhear it. South Park is really good for just brain worms like that. You get an idea in your head from South Park, and it just lives there forever.
Yep.
Makes you wonder what would happen if they were neutral good rather than chaotic good.
Yeah.
Sometimes. I really want to suggest highly, massively, Carmina Burana to listen to. If listeners do want to hear kind of what a constructed historical fantasy soundtrack might be, please listen to Carmina Burana. It's by Carl Orff, who is also really huge in educational philosophy, and that's how I sort of listen to him. But it's this big old vocal work with orchestra where they sing in Latin and they chant, and it sounds ancient, and it was written in like the early 1900s. And I would also like to recommend, I had another one too. I was going to recommend ballets. If you want to hear music that gives you a storyline, listen to a ballet. I'm going to highly, highly recommend Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky, which you may also know from the Darren Aronofsky movie Black Swan. That got kind of a little bit remixed in that soundtrack, but please listen to the original because Tchaikovsky is amazing. When you're looking for music that tells a story, ballet is a really good place to go, especially if you don't like opera, like you can't stand that sort of classical voice sound that we talked about in Carmen.
If you want to learn about fantasy literature, we touched a lot on like the pieces that go into the
We
genre.
ended up talking a lot about fantasy,
Yeah. So I would recommend A Short History of Fantasy by Farah Mendelssohn and Edward James. It breaks down a lot of these subcategories, the history of the genre, and it also has a really great reading list in it. So if you're interested, as a Game of Thrones fan or a fantasy noob or whatever,
an analytical mind in search of answers.
There we go. I like it. Okay, now we can assign homework.
Homework, everybody's favorite.
The first thing that we're going to ask you to do is to tweet at us your favorite movie or film soundtrack.
I'm really interested to hear about these because I have a theory that 90% of them will be John Williams.
Yeah?
I think, actually, no, 95%. Like, what's your favorite? You can't say Game of Thrones.
It's not Game of Thrones. I think probably the only soundtrack I can say that I've listened to is the Harry Potter soundtrack.
Wow, guess who that is?
Is it?
John Williams.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so tweet at us and use the hashtag WSCPod so we can find you guys.
Yeah, I really want to hear what people have to say.
The other bit of homework is that we're going to start letting you know what our next episode will be so that you can consume the text before listening. So next week we are going to be talking about Anthem by
Ayn Rand. We can do it.
Yep.
We looked up this pronunciation.
Ayn
Rand.
And the album that the Canadian band Rush wrote an album based on, and that is 2112. So the homework will be linked in the show notes. Yeah.
And to be very clear, we will be talking about Anthem and 2112. 2112 and Anthem. If you would like to just consume one of them, you will be missing half of the picture.
Yes, this is a listener suggestion. So if you have any suggestions for future episodes, tweet at us. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us at our email.
On Facebook.
All the places.
Messenger Pigeon. Smoke Signal. Find us where you can. We will come. Thanks for listening. Wild Sound Civilized is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Attawandarong peoples. Transcripts are available on our website.
Our intro music is Fantasia in D minor by Georg Philipp Telemann, performed by Bigley Duff. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Wild Sound Civilized with a Z. You can email us at wildsoundcivilizedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you liked what you heard here today, you can support us on patreon.com/wildsoundcivilized.